All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the next session of the RenderMan Art and Science Fair. This is Peeling Back the Layers, ILM's MaterialX Lama. I want to introduce myself. My name is Mark Manka, and I'm the RenderMan product manager. And I actually also have a co-host I want to introduce, a llama, a magical unicorn llama, because, you know, llama's kind of magical. Actually, it's not magical. It's the product of, you know, when artists and scientists and engineers get together to evolve the technology of rendering, you know, in service of storytelling. So, you know, I think it's magical. So we're going to put it back here. Sorry, Buzz and Woody. You know, you wish you had a llama. So we're just going to cover you up and have that back there and help us out. But what is Lama, you might be asking? You likely have some idea because you're here in this session, but in order to set the stage, let's look at a little quick demo video, little sizzle reel of what Lama is. All right. With that, I'd love to welcome my co-panelists to the stage. We have Andre Mazon from ILM, Jonathan Moulin from ILM, Eric Walkman from Laika, and Rick Sayer from Pixar. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive in, it's always good to do a little bit of a hello roundtable. So we'll just go in a circle. Can you tell us, you know, just a little bit about yourself, what you do, and then a get to know you question. Everyone always hates these, so we're going to keep this one simple. Eric, you have a huge pile of teapots, and so we're going to ask everybody what your favorite RenderMan teapot is. So go around the room. Eric, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. That's a good question. I don't know. I'm gonna have to go with the one with the flames on it.
Good choice.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about yourself and what you do at Laika?
Yeah, I'm a CG supervisor at Laika. I kind of oversee all of the digital look development side of things and make sure that all of the practical or the digital stuff that we make on the VFX side matches all the practical stuff that we do on the practical side of things.
Thank you. Andre, you're next up.
Hi, I'm Andre Mazzoni. I joined ILM in 2002 during Attack of the Clones to help them transition from SGI to Linux on PCs. I think we were using RenderMan 3.8 at the time, maybe. So that predates a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Seen a lot of rendering techniques come and go, but have helped get us to the point where we are in the current sort of best practice of physically based rendering, path tracing, and machine learning based denoising. Just wanted to say thanks for everyone for the invite to be here, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. And my favorite RenderMan teapot is the one that was the alpha channel. I think that was the one that I liked the best.
Nice. I think that was a special one at the user group.
Yep.
Cool. All right, Rick, you're next up.
Howdy, my name's Rick Sayer. I'm a visual effects supervisor at Pixar Animation Studios, and devil's advocate is another thing my business card used to say. I've been at Pixar since the 80s, so seen a lot of things, a lot of rendering techniques come and go over the years. And, you know, there's an interesting aspect here. Ivan Sutherland mentioned this thing he called the wheel of reincarnation for graphics display processors, and I think there's aspects of that in rendering as well. As far as favorite teapot, I tend to give mine away. So I guess my favorite is the one I have over here in the corner. And from here, all I can see is that it says that it is walking. So I guess my favorite are the ones that walk.
Nice. Jonathan.
Yep. So hello everyone. Yeah, my name is Jonathan Moulin. I work at ILM in London, and I'm a lighting and look dev supervisor over there. I don't have anything very particular to say about myself in the industry, except that I enjoy doing pretty pictures, and RenderMan always been helpful for that. And my favorite teapot is this one, just because it's very cute, and it reminds me of Coco, which is a movie I like a lot.
Nice. Dang it. I was actually going to also show the Coco one as mine. This is my favorite, but you beat me to it. That's okay. That's okay. We can still be friends. Actually, so now let's go ahead and just jump in. I'd love to set the stage a little bit and start to ask a little bit about the history of kind of look development and how we ended up walking this road to Lama from multiple perspectives. So, Andre, do you mind kind of kicking us off and giving us kind of the history at ILM, maybe from a technical perspective? And then we'll leave some of the artist perspective side of the question too.
Yeah, sure, of course. At its core, Lama is basically a material building framework. It's designed, as Mark just said, to be artist-friendly. It allows the creation of materials by combining individual components together, but while still ensuring that energy conservation and rendering performance is maintained. It's very similar to the idea of what a pattern graph would do, or a texture graph would do for textures, where you have some component nodes and some operators that combine them together. And it just allows you to create a more expressive material without any dedicated programmers to write any extra functionality that you might need. Artists should be able to create a layered material models very easily, with a flexibility that reaches deep into the heart of what a surface material really is.
Mark, I think you're muted.
Should I say something more, Mark?
No, I should say to remember to unmute myself. So, Rick, I'm curious to get your perspective on things, right? You mentioned, you've seen a lot of kind of technology evolve and maybe even come back. How does Lama fit into this continuum of technologies from way back, when people were hand coding RSL shaders to the modern age? Like where does it fit within this continuum?
Yeah, yes, indeed. And there's a part of this which is like, how much time do you have? But I think in brief, it's useful to even pose the question, what do we mean by material? In the earliest days of Rays and going back to the shade tree paper, every G-prim had a shader, and a shader was a little bit of SL code. And going back to the beginning, every shader conflated illumination, or what we might call light transport, and pattern generation. So you could say that a shader was a material, and that was a pattern and some kind of light response. There wasn't really any light transport beyond first hit. And again, it was all kind of just right there in that shader. So lights weren't really lights. They didn't really have intrinsic properties. They were collections of parameters. And you would call something in your shader that would loop over all the lights, and then you might call the specular function, or you just do it yourself. And so that meant that shader authors were doing all these things themselves, and sometimes not even knowing, is what I'm doing a BXDF, or is that a pattern? These things were all stirred up. So, that was kind of in the beginning. We had a mass market in giant air quotes, because it wasn't like there was a big market for that sort of thing back then, for what we called Pixar looks, which were these commercially available, and we sold a few shaders.
I have my thoughts on.
There you go.
Yeah,
See?
I use those.
And again, that continued that conflation of these things. You know, you want polka dots? No, you get plastic polka dots. The pattern and the light response were all kind of jammed up together. So through commercials, same deal. Through Toy Story, kind of the same deal. I had written an A buffer ray tracer in the shading language that we could use for glossy reflections, some first hit ray tracing effects, some other things. And the only way that that could work was to jam it into every shader. If your shader didn't call the right thing, then this thing wouldn't happen. So, and I think the frog and Wind the Frog was one of the motivators for that. But this, you know, again, that wasn't really standardization. So for us, at least at Pixar, by the time of Bug's Life, we knew we wanted some of these effects that weren't an intrinsic part of the RenderMan specular diffuse ambient calls. So we were going to basically be writing our own illumination functions for everything. And in order for that to have a chance, we had to back off, take a little control away from the shader authors, but in exchange, let them focus on the creative part and abstract away, you know, we wouldn't dare call it light transport yet, but abstract away that part of it. And that could guarantee the things that we wanted. We wanted, you know, backlighting and translucency and some thin surface stuff. So through that, we had the beginnings of a framework. And we began to call that material. And so the material was this combination of light transport and pattern generation. And once we started to do that, there was enough framework that you could have layering. And the first way we did that was parameter blending, and then realized that was a terrible idea. So we had mechanisms to, in our framework, you did a material under. So you would call material under, material under, material under, and that just allowed an efficient early out. Those fellow travelers will remember the if ever construct that allowed you to sort of short circuit stuff in shader evaluation. So, you know, fast forward, there's a lot more where that came from. You know, along the way, the journey from multiple generations of the shading language compilers so that we could get off of everything's just macros and begin to have things that were rudimentary functions, and then later things that even started to look like classes. We had a network, you know, visual network. Well, first we had our own internal thing, then we had Slim. And at a certain point, we got maybe a little clearer differentiation between the, you know, air quotes, light transport, which was just done by a very small set of people, and pattern generation that was open for everyone using the node-based environment. And that, you know, that served us pretty much until the first RIS show, until Finding Dory. In fact, we have to take some steps back because we did early path tracing on Monsters University, but without, you know, I'm already driving off the road into the weeds, without getting too far afield there. Basically, where we ended up, and at that point, RIS drove us there, was an Uber shader, and that Uber shader had a fixed number of different lobes and various ways that you could combine them, but all pretty simple. So the material layering was taken away. The layering of materials, you had a lot of expressivity in the way you did pattern generation, much more limited ways that you could construct your own BXDFs. In fact, you basically couldn't without programming, and a very rigid way that you would layer these Uber shaders together. And that's part of what I'm referring to as the wheel of reincarnation, because now we come back around to Llamas once again, allowing that same node flexibility to apply to BXDF and light transport, which I think is, fantastic and exciting. There's a bunch of things that I really, really like about it. In particular, this notion of every path takes one path through the graph, and that means that if you have an incredibly complicated, set of lobes, it doesn't get slower. It might get noisier, so the variance can increase, but you don't sort of blow the render out of the water. And then you can use the affordances in RenderMan that allow you to tune sample budgets based on objects to deal with it. So again, your first reaction as an artist is not everything got slow and my render soup's yelling at me. So that's fantastic. There's a bunch of other things that we'll go into when we talk. I think I love the fact that now we're back to being able to very flexibly, at the last minute, do optimizations and changes. Like you can, at relatively low risk, without having to go back and reshade everything, realize you're in a jam and completely bypass and switch out illumination and even pattern generation, swap in like an average color diffuse based on ray cone size. A lot of really cool possibilities there.
We were in the exact same situation. I mean, we came from, a very, very robust layering system, using Slim and RSL2 on Kubo. And then we got RIS and all of that stuff kind of went away, and we ended up with the same, almost the exact same situation as you guys did. Missing Link was done all in RIS, and we ended up having to go to an Uber shader style workflow, and that really kind of, put a big, we had to change our workflows quite a bit, which is one of the reasons why we are kind of moving to Lama, and where we are now.
Nice. Jonathan, I'd love to get your artist perspective. I can imagine there's echoes of a lot of what people have said kind of from the artist perspective. I imagine there's some unique bits, right? Like how did the artists help drive ILM forward towards Lama?
Yeah, so what happened is at ILM for the biggest part of the last 10 years, we've been heavily relying on an Uber shader that is still heavily in use at ILM at the moment, which gave us a lot of flexibility. We gained a lot from having an Uber shader and having something simplified that everybody can use. It made the texture work a lot easier, a lot more visual, and it improved the quality of our asset in general and the speed at which we could produce some. But then we were also occasionally hitting a bit of a bump for the more complex assets or the elements that were more difficult, that require more flexibility. And I think that's really where Lama came into the play, pretty much exactly for the reason that Rick and Eric pointed out, which is that if you have to build a very complex shading network to achieve something very peculiar or very unique, you're hit by a lot of potential problems. Performance is one of them. Secondary, you could be limited by what the Uber shader allows you to do. So let's say, I don't know, you're creating a super fancy creature and you want for whatever reason, you need like a third or fourth spec lobe and your Uber shader doesn't have it. Well, you're stuck. There's not much you can do there except cheating and trying to do parameter blending, etc., everywhere to kind of achieve the look you want. And so the reflection behind Lama kind of came back from that originally, was that it's missing that flexibility, that ease of use in terms of not having to rely on R&D every single time we want to add something into the shader. And typically because at ILM we are extremely templated and we work out of a lot of templates, you don't want to integrate new stuff in the template that may break the behavior of something that was used before. And so it's kind of that combination of having more flexibility, more creative freedom, and more optimization option that kind of drove the Lama project to start at ILM, really.
Like, I find that the notion of Uber shader really quite interesting on kind of how it grew up, and then kind of this reciprocal nature of coming back to layered shading via Lama or proper layers rather than parameter blending. Is there still a place where you would want to use Uber shaders? Maybe this is a question for Eric or Jonathan. Is there still a place, or should you like wholly move to Lama and that's all anybody should ever do? Like, if you were to recommend to somebody, what would you recommend that they do?
I mean, I think the best of both worlds is great. The flexibility is where it's at. We still use Uber shaders to a certain degree. We'll build out a network that's a base material, and then that'll go out and it'll have a UI on it, and everybody will use that. But if you have to get in there and edit it, we have the ability to do that, which is great now.
That's exactly what we're doing as well. Yeah. I think in the way that there is massive benefit having a templated shader that everybody knows, because not only the very expert hands of like a LookDev or a Lightning TD will potentially do some rendering. So sometimes you want a shader that is easy to use for somebody that may have a bit less knowledge in the area, where they can already plug a few things or tweak a few knobs and then get a nice result. So we're not moving away from that. We're just replacing the under the hood old-fashioned Uber shader that was very static by a network of Lama node that we then publish as an Uber shader.
Yeah,
and that's something that you can totally do.
It's pretty much exactly what we're doing as well.
Yes, I think it's worth saying here that the advantage of an Uber shader is not just that it's a single component, but that it represents a paradigm of working. And this is where you get efficiencies of scale, especially if you have to finish 500 shots in a short number of time, short number of hours or weeks or whatever. So having a clearly defined way of working is very useful, but having the ability to create new versions of these templates is also very useful. So what we've seen at ILM is as an attempt to reduce some of this Wild West complexity that you might imagine happening when anybody can create anything that they want. We generally tend to converge around 5 or 6 different commonly used networks that have been generated for a particular purpose, but we're restricting the amount of per shot overrides as much as we can, because we obviously want to limit the complexity.
And on that particular point as well, I think what is really nice when under the hood the shader or the templates now using Lama is that if for whatever reason, for a given shot or a given sets of shots or element of a sequence, you need to have something a bit more custom on top of that particular look, you can, because the whole frameworks allow it. Suddenly anybody can add and edit and add the elements that you may want as part of the look. And so, yeah, I think that's the strong flexibility there from the creativity, but also from a supervision point of view. It's a nice thing to have, to be able to say, well, we know we can add, I don't know, you have a character walking in the scene, you suddenly need to make him wet, and so that might not be the base look, so you can add like a wetness layer quite easily, or an extra dirt layer, or anything like this, and it would be fairly straightforward thanks to Lama, really.
So maybe this is a question for you, Jonathan, but possibly you, Eric, as you work towards Lama. So a lot of times, there'll be variants of models, right? There's the wet version of the model, and then there's the dry version of the model. When you're talking about doing per shot overrides, like, do you picture kind of working in shot, or do you picture like a specific variant would get created that would then be brought into the shot? How do you picture Lama perhaps bringing an additional level of flexibility to either side of the pipeline? What would you recommend to people?
Go ahead, Jonathan. You can
I think it depends on the case. Yeah, it really depends on the case. I think the vast majority of the time, if an asset's going to be used over and over again with a certain variation, we would want to have that available easily. That way, maybe the people lighting the shot don't have to worry about the shaders. But there will be, it's very common in visual effects to have a particular node from a client for a particular shot, where it's something that maybe hasn't been accounted for. And so just having the flexibility to jump in and do that request from our client is invaluable, instead of having to go back to a full asset, republish it all for something that was very specific to a single element. So it's really, depending on the case, you'll do one or the other. I think the vast majority of the time you want to prep and have things fold off in advance when you're building assets, but there is just having the notion of that flexibility gives you the peace of mind that you can edit that later if you need to.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. That's kind of how we go about it. It's not always in the asset. Sometimes a wet look will be done completely in a shot if it's only for like 1 or 2 shots or something like that. And it really depends on what it is. In the past, we would use mechanisms like code shading and things, and all these other kind of mechanisms to bind things in at the last minute. If we wanted to throw a displacement on the whole world, we could just do that at the very end, or throw dirt shaders on at the very end. Now we have to think about it a little bit more. Even with Lama, we still have to kind of prep for the fact that we may end up wanting to do certain things at the last minute. We have a little bit more flexibility with sample filters and things like that than we had, because we use a lot of sample filters for color corrections, nodes that talk to shaders and things like that. But yeah, so I mean, it really kind of depends on the situation and what the art direction is, really. If we know it's going to be wet through 90% of the movie, we'll build it into the look.
Thanks. I want to get back to a little bit of the technology and touch upon a point you made, Rick, during your conversation about when it was the Wild West and you could do anything, you could do some really interesting things, but you could get yourself into trouble. Does Lama, at least when I look at Lama, I see it as an interesting place where you have a lot of room for experimentation, but does it protect you from shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak? How do I keep myself using Lama from going off to a place that isn't necessarily good from a rendering perspective?
Well, one thing from a philosophical perspective that I think is actually great about Lama is that, and we're getting off a little bit into the rendering developer side, and by that I don't mean RenderMan developer, but we used to call them illumination engineers. Someone on a show crew working to tinker with light transport in service of whatever style of lighting that show might have. And to go in and write your own BXDF raw in RIS is quite a challenge. And to touch an Uber shader that's been written by someone else is potentially an even taller challenge. So the other thing that I think is really attractive about Lama, and the thing that I mention when people say, hey, I'm making a cartoon, I don't need any of this physically based visual effects stuff. It doesn't force you to do that. And the thing that's so nice is that dealing with the integrator and dealing with some of the guts is abstracted away from you. Lama has essentially the API you see as a shading artist, but it also has the API that you code to if you're going to write your own BXDF. So you can do that in a relatively straightforward way. There's a nice way of getting in there and making a new thing. So you can make a toon shader and have that play very nicely with physically based effects. You don't have to have it be energy conserving if you don't want to. There's a lot of things that are nice about that that I think can help prevent you from hurting yourself. Again, you can do anything and you don't have to use it, but I think there's a lot to be gained by operating within that framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the old RSL2 days, you could definitely shoot yourself in the foot with energy conservation. If you started layering up too many loads and not really keeping track of what you were doing, you didn't want to give that to a junior artist or anything like that. That was just kind of So yeah, Llama kind of helps level that out a little bit.
Shoot everyone in the foot with an infinite series of automated machine shotguns.
Yeah, that's more accurate representation.
I think I'm going to have to jump in here and be that guy for a little bit because we don't actually provide an API for Llama at this moment with RenderMan. So Rick can definitely do this, but sorry, nobody else can as yet.
A taste of things to come.
Yeah, we're anxiously waiting.
And I think that speaks. Now I have to put on my marketing hat, so excuse me. But that speaks to the special relationship between Pixar and ILM. For those of you that know your computer graphics history, that history goes back to the beginning, and so we love our relationship. We love our friends at ILM, and it's really kind of together. We can bring these things to fruition. But Andre, since you spoke, I'm going to get back to actual questions now. Andre, I have a question, right? We've been using the term Llama kind of colloquially. I don't know why that one's a tongue twister for me, but that's not his real name. Its real name is MaterialX Lama. Can you speak a little bit about kind of Llama and MaterialX?
Sure. Yeah. So as we are now releasing Llama to the greater CG community, we've tried to make it very clear that it's actually part of Lucasfilm's MaterialX initiative. And let me just give you a bit of the 25 words or less version of what that is. MaterialX is an open standard that allows the definition and exchange of look development and appearance across multiple applications and renderers. It's just like Llama. It's a load-based composition system. But unlike Llama, the aim with MaterialX is to provide as much expression as possible to encode almost any look that can be expressed. And because of this, the primitives in MaterialX are quite granular. Llama's goal is somewhat complementary to this, and that is it still has this building blocks idea, but it's intended to be more simple to use and artistically expressive rather than trying to serve every single need it could possibly have. It's trying to abstract away some of this granularity, if you will. Let me give you a small example. So for a glass material, let's say, you've got the obvious properties that you're going to require, like reflection and refraction, right? It reflects light, it transmits light. But it's also very useful to have absorption. Sometimes you have varnishes or you have glass with tints in it. Sometimes you have some cloudy glass and you might want some internal scattering to happen. Lama packages these all up in Lama Dielectric as an easy-to-use sort of recipe of how to render glass. But if you were to look at the MaterialX definition of this, because its aim is to express anything it possibly can, you'll find in excess of 20 odd nodes that are stuck together with various components in order to make this all work. So we're also trying to make it quite clear that Llama is a part of the MaterialX effort. They're not separate things, even though historically they did sort of come from slightly different efforts. But coincident with the RenderMan 24 release, either they're on the repo right now or will be very soon, we're providing Llama MaterialX definitions, or I should say MaterialX definitions of the Llama nodes, so that the parameter interface and the behavior of each of these nodes can be examined. And should you have a conforming MaterialX implementation, like will be coming in some of the Autodesk products, you should potentially be able to connect some of these nodes together, these Llama nodes together, and have a render that in some way matches the behavior that you'll see if you do the same thing with RenderMan interface. Yeah.
Cool, nice. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. For those of you kind of listening in the audience, you're definitely encouraged to put a question in the questions tab, and we have people behind the scenes answering a few of them, and we've gotten to some already, and we'll try to get to a few more. But I want to get super specific. And I think we've kind of answered this next question more or less, but maybe in a little bit of a roundabout way. But let's just get to it explicitly. And Jonathan, I think that from an artist perspective, this is where I'd like to give this a go with others chiming in. The question is, what are the benefits of using Lama over Pixar layer surface? Will it make Pixar layer surface obsolete? Or what are some scenarios where you will use Lama over Pixar layer surface?
I think in the case of Pixar layer surface, I would use Lama all the time over it. I think it's just a more modern view on how to do the layering of those material in the way that you're allowed, because you're allowed to layer, mix, and or additively add different lobes. You don't have to manage all the surplus of other parameters that may come from a previous Pixar surface that you may not need just for the layering that you need. So within Lama, you can just put the elements that you need together to get your final result. Where you also get a lot more benefits in the way energy conservation is done from layers to layers. There's been a lot of work going on into Lama just to make those particular elements particularly strong, and sometimes I think better than anything that's been out there in a public package so far. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of answered the question, hopefully.
Cool. The next question, I think I might answer a little bit of it, but then I'll pass off the other part of the question maybe to you, Andre. But I'll do the first bit. The question is, it seems like there's not feature parity between Pixar Surface and Lama yet. For example, the lack of manifold walk for caustics rendering. As the prevalence of MaterialX increases, is it planned to get that feature parity and make Lama the default for RenderMan? So I'll just answer part of that, and then I'll evolve the question for you, Andre. You know, it's hard for us on the RenderMan team to make presumptions about how artists and productions want to work. You know, I think what you've heard here is sometimes an Uber shader is the right thing still for certain use cases, and Pixar Surface is that. So, you know, I can't picture us deprecating Pixar Surface or naming Pixar Surface or Lama as the default that you should use. It's going to vary depending on what you're trying to do and how your productions are set up. You know, that might change in the future, of course, but as for now, that would be where we are. But it kind of leads me to a question that I have that's a follow-up question. Andre, you know, as you speak with your artists, you know, you collaborate with Jonathan and others, like, do you have kind of future goals in mind for Lama? Like, how would you see it evolving?
So, Jonathan, if you don't mind, I'll go first, and you can follow up.
Yep.
I think it'll be interesting to mention right at this point that Lama really comes out of production requirements. We work very much on the problems that we have currently, and the requests that we get from our artists. Many of them are from Jonathan, to be honest. Are always there are always a balance about which we decide to implement, which we don't. The comment about manifold walk, it's a requested feature that we do want to do at some point. We just haven't got the chance to do it there yet. So the other thing to note from this is, because it is based on production needs, it's continually evolving. I think if anybody looks at the differences between what's in Lama for RenderMan 24.0 and 24.1, you'll notice that things are changing and things are progressing. And we're going to have to be a bit more careful than we have been in the past to coordinate with the RenderMan team to make sure that we're not, you know, shooting people in the foot unnecessarily. But it is an evolving thing, and we do plan to add new functionality in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, I think on the artist side, it's exactly as Andre stated. I think Lama evolves based on what is the need. I think there is a few areas around Lama that I think at ILM we are going to want to look into in the future, depending on the show requirement. I think that it's difficult to answer now, like if there's going to be some of those elements coming up for sure. But I think we're always looking closely at, typically as what you mentioned there, like the manifold for caustics. I think all those kinds of elements are things that in visual effects we always want to be able to push the things further. So yeah, I would expect Lama to keep evolving, potentially seeing some new Lama nodes in the future as well.
Nice. I want to switch gears to adoption a little bit, right? Like, kind of full disclosure, we haven't adopted Lama yet at Pixar's studio, right? Rick, you've been evaluating it. What are some of the things you've been hearing from artists, as we think about what it might mean someday to adopt Lama? Like, are people excited about it? They have some trepidation. There's no right answer here, right? Both reactions are natural. But what have you been hearing from artists?
I think internally there's a lot of excitement because it adds, that trip on the wheel. It adds back the ability to be creative with the surface response, just as artists are creative with pattern generation, which isn't to say that with an Uber shader you're not being creative, but there's a different kind of expressivity when you can do anything, or when you can do it within bounds. So I think there is a lot of excitement. There's trepidation, of course, because there is and are a bunch of ways of working that are built into our Uber shaders and the support machinery behind that. Our shading environment automatically does things to help you. And back in that spirit of full disclosure, as I think folks who've been following the other talks today have heard a little bit about our flow tool and the real-time rendering. Is basically a real-time shader look dev environment. And because of the work involved in that really means that in order to adopt Lama, we're kind of waiting for full XPU all the time with everything to make that feasible. And then once we have that, really taking a step to look at what are the things that we want to preserve from Pixar Surface, what are the things that we don't. But also to the points I think other folks have mentioned, you don't want to just blow it all up and have a giant graph that everyone has to tinker with all the time. We want to have that same kind of, almost recursive Houdini style dive in and out of networks and have some pre-generated, pre-populated networks with nice high-level affordances on top of them for artists to use that you can dig into when you want to. And that's development work as well. So I think a lot of excitement and a lot of wariness on the software side of understanding this is going to be a journey.
Nice. Eric, I think Laika is further along than we are, or we are as Pixar.
Yeah, I took a little less democratic approach and pretty much just told everybody we're using Lama. So
nice.
that's kind of where we started.
And how are people taking to it? Like, are they taking to it?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part. I mean, I've moved over some of our more, a few of our more complicated materials, and I've had some of the other artists start moving materials over, and it's great. I think people are getting back to what they used to be able to do, and on that front, and I think everybody's pretty excited about it. The results are looking great. We're able to kind of hit some of these crazier materials that we have to do. We end up doing a lot of really weird stuff because everything in our studio is handmade for the most. Everything's made by hand, and it's got layers of paint, and layers of clear coat, and layers of just weird stuff, whatever they can grab off the shelf to kind of make some of these things. So the layering, it's super important to us. Our cloth is sometimes it's printed cloth, and then it's got layers of paint on top of it, and then they dye sub print on top of that, and it's a lot of layers, and Lama makes sense in that respect for us. So.
think as an artist, it allows you to think as one material at a time and then combine them, which makes complex material or photorealistic material much easier to think of, because you can just decompose how the real material is made and just build it up the same way, and not having to think about it in terms of parameter blending and just switching textures, etc. You can literally build more library of your material or a library of your effect that you know you're going to use, and then kind of reapply that where it makes sense.
Yeah, in our practical departments, they step, they process out every step along their process, or they write it out, so we know exactly, well, I did this, and then we painted on top of this, and then we sprayed that, so we can basically just go through and replicate that process when we get into the more complex shading. We also do, like I said, Uber style shaders where we have a nice UI on top of like a more complicated, like our RP material or something. It has a pretty nice user parameter, artist-friendly UI that's on top of there that everybody can just kind of dive into and just get a pretty good result right out of the box. But if you get into a shot and it's starting to look kind of CG and we got to figure out why it's looking CG, we can jump into that network and pull things out, add things to it. So that's pretty great.
Eric, how have you found the relationship between your physical, the physical material itself and then the Lama version of it? Like, how close can you get? If you had 3 layers of varnish, are you doing 3 specular lobes? Like, how far do you go?
Pretty far. At least, it's still early days for us. I mean, we're still building, replicating materials. But as far as our RP material is a pretty good example of that. It's got it's all subsurface scattering. I mean, that material doesn't do anything but scatter for the most part. And it has, 4 layers of specular, on top of it. And that's a pretty base, that's our base layer for that. It does a lot of weird color conversion stuff in there. And a lot of like this, the specular, we use the dielectric type stuff on top of it in order to kind of get some of the specular buildup and the absorption in there. But yeah, works. We try to mimic as much as we can.
And how was the learning curve for artists? Like, was it just they started playing with it and away they went, or was there a bit of, how steep was that?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the guys that are doing it here have been doing this for a while, so it wasn't too much of a learning curve for the most part. There was some little confusion about exactly what was energy conserving and where all that was happening at first when we first got some of the beta stuff, and just kind of diving through that and getting some questions answered, and what was the best way about going, was actually layering it better than actually doing, adds or doing mixes, and what was happening between the two. So it was just more terminology, and then really then huge learning curves. But
I think it's difficult to talk on that end purely at ILM, purely because we've been through the development of Lama over the years. I think there's definitely a learning curve coming from like an Uber shader where everything is pre-built for you, even within the Uber shader, in terms of what's the logic that you want to apply. But from my experience, most people that were completely new to it, in a matter of a few play and run and a few mistakes that a lot of people are going to bump into at some point and then get over, they build really fantastic results very quickly. Because you have ultimately the number of building blocks are not massive. You just need to know your base materials and what they mean, and the few combiners that you have between the additive combiner, the mixing combiner, and the layering combiner. And then once you understand those different relations, it's fairly straightforward. And I think in a similar way to what Rink was mentioning earlier about each ray like just doing one path. And in relation to your question earlier, Mark, about how you're safeguarding people doing crazy stuff, fundamentally in Lama you have like the notion of there is only really 2 big types of material. You have the materials that transmit and you have the one that don't. And so if you understand that notion, basically from the moment you use a dielectric, which is a transmitting material, you're going to transmit some energy. If you do 26 dielectric on top of each other, you may at some point have some issues with performance. And that's pretty much the only real case where you're going to have a problem, because from the moment you're hitting a material that doesn't transmit, the ray kind of stops there, because the ray goes to that material and then the transmission stops. You can make some crazy stuff with the additive materials as well if you want to, but then in that case you're already breaking energy anyway. That's the basic principle of the additive material, except if you're manually kind of compensating for the energy. So there, it just shows with a setup like this that there is a fundamental need to understand a bit more what you're building, potentially. Like, not at the very complex level, but like understand that most surfaces are like a diffuse and a specular on top of it, like to be the most basic surface you can do, pretty much. And once you've understood those basic principles, then Lama gives you a lot of flexibility, and it's very easy to create your own artistic output, really.
I think it's probably also worth mentioning that what kind of learning curve there is depends on the size of a shop you are and how you're actually deploying this to artists. There's a big difference between building your own networks in Lama and using something that's been constructed with Lama. And from that perspective, you could make it as if here's a new Uber shader, which under the hood is Lama. And so from that, on that side, it's kind of just like it always was, except it's easier to spin and modify that Uber shader.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, actually, Rick. And I think it speaks a lot to some of the other use cases that people were bringing up about being able to layer things or do interesting things on a per shot basis. So maybe you have an Uber shader that's there in a standard workflow for people in a studio, and everybody knows how to use it, but then that additional flexibility can be added later, made available to artists, on
Yeah, we typically only have a few people that write, networks, that build networks, and then it's all parameter based after that. And then if you need to build something kind of fancy, then there's one or two people that kind of do that stuff. You don't typically have everybody building massive networks.
Yeah, that's the same pattern that we've seen at ILM too. There's like 4 or 5 people that are really doing that kind of work constantly, and most people are just using the aggregated networks that are being provided with a nice public interface to pick out the parameters that are useful to modify.
Yep.
Well, you guys, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. I want to give a special thanks to Rick and Eric for participating. But also to ILM, Andre and Jonathan and everybody else at ILM for sharing this technology with the RenderMan team and with the world. It's a great step, so very, very much appreciated. But before we wrap up, one final kind of lightning round, so to speak. In 5 words or less, what's everybody's favorite Lama node or Lama feature? Andre, starting with you.
So, I mean, I could give you a nice trite answer to that and say that Lama Surface is the best node because every node has to plug into that to use the network. But thinking about it this morning, I was thinking, well, maybe Lama, the emissive component that we have, because you can actually do any kind of light transport you want. You could write your own integrator if you want, or paint your way out of a problem. So maybe the emissive load is my favorite.
Nice, I like that. Rick?
I think, well, single feature, in a way, it's existence. The fact that we once again have a mechanism for constructing graphs with BXDFs. If I had to pick one particular technical nugget, it's definitely the one path per ray approach. I think that's pretty wonderful.
That's cool. That's because of its scalability. Eric, you're up.
Well, I've been having a lot of fun with the dielectric node lately, so I'm going to go with that one. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo what Rick said. I mean, being able to get back to where we can just, put this material on top of that material and not have to worry about parameter munging and all this other stuff that goes on. That's pretty awesome.
Nice. Jonathan?
I think I'll go with the Lama layer because I think it's at the core of what Lama is. It discussed with all those other nodes and apply the clever stuff that the R&D dudes been working hard on to do great light transport and energy conservation and kind of improve the looks of materials with things like IOR tracking and energy compensations, etc. And so I think, yeah, it has to go to that one, as simple as it is.
Perfect, I love it. Well, thank you everyone. From myself and my co-host, thank you for attending, and we hope to see you in future RenderMan sessions. Happy rendering. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.